Steve Austin can be one salty SOB when he wants to be. Just like his character, he knows how to stand up for himself. When he said that he didn't want to lose to someone, there was usually a good reason for it. But there were also times when he just hated the person across the ring from him. Owen Hart was one of those guys that nobody ever seemed to have a bad word for. He was one of the members of the Hart family that didn't take himself too seriously. And while he was known backstage as the king of practical jokes, he never pushed it too far. In 1997, Owen was finally getting the recognition that he deserved as a singles wrestler, having won the Intercontinental Championship. Stone Cold was on his way up too, and it was becoming very clear that Austin was a future megastar in the WWF. The men were set to clash at SummerSlam for the title in one of the most anticipated matches on the undercard. But things did not go to plan during the match, as Owen botched a tombstone piledriver, dropping Austin on his head. It was a terrifying moment as Austin was momentarily paralysed. He later said that he couldn't feel anything from his neck down. He was later diagnosed with a bruised spinal cord, and he came very close to becoming permanently paralysed. While Owen took full responsibility for the injury, Austin was naturally pissed off, and it didn't help that Owen didn't bother to call Austin after the show to discuss the situation, and that really irritated Austin and made him feel disrespected. According to Bret Hart, Owen himself was a mess after the event. He wasn't necessarily ignoring Austin, he was just trying to sort his own head out. The men did have a rubber match at the Survivor Series in November, but Austin made sure that the match was kept short. On that night, he beat him in just 4 minutes to win the IC title. It was around that time that Jeff Jarrett returned to the WWF and was promised a feud with Stone Cold. But Austin had other ideas. On an episode of Raw, Jarrett cut a promo. Now here's a guy who's lowered himself to shaving his head and coming out here every week, not once or twice, but 10 or 15 times, and saying the word ass. That's right, saying the word ass just to get a reaction, just to get noticed. Stone Cold, you will always be the ringmaster, and as far as your blasphemous merchandise, that offends me. Austin 316 offends me because what you're doing is ripping off the Bible to put money in your own pockets. Austin hadn't approved that promo and had no idea that Jarrett was going to go out there and say those words, and he was furious about it. After years of frustration, he'd finally hit upon a character that fans were going crazy for, and he didn't want this jabroni messing it up for him. As Jarrett came backstage, Austin tore him a new asshole in front of everyone, leaving Jarrett red in the face. He made it very clear that he would never work with him one-on-one. Austin also felt that Jarrett was too much of a pussy in the ring to work with. On his podcast he said, Jarrett wasn't physical enough, he didn't hit the ropes hard enough, and it wasn't a case of me being able to bring him up, more a case of him bringing me down because of how hot I was. I'm not out there UFC shoot fighting, but Jesus Christ, lay some stuff in on me, bust my mouth, whatever. That's the way I did it when I was feeding comebacks on DX and all those guys. I mean, guys would be walking backstage with busted lips and noses, loose teeth. I was throwing sledgehammers in there and people were going crazy. That's just the way it was. He can't hit the ropes hard enough to bust an egg, but Austin already had another reason to dislike Jarrett before he'd even arrived in the WWF. Early on in his career, Austin worked in the Memphis territory for the Jarrett family, and he was paid incredibly poorly by them. He was paid so badly that he had to live in his car on a diet of potatoes. After a show one night, Austin stood staring at his paycheck. Allegedly, Jeff Jarrett slapped Austin on the back and laughed. Staring at the numbers ain't gonna make them any bigger, kid. That condescending insult from the boss's son stayed with Austin forever, and Jarrett could never have predicted that Austin would become one of wrestling's biggest superstars. Jarrett himself would never achieve anything higher the mid-card status in the WWF. But one man who can claim to have been on the same level as Austin is Hulk Hogan. The Hulkster returned to the WWF in 2002, and it would have been a dream match to see these two face each other at WrestleMania 18. But in the end, the match with Hogan went to The Rock because Austin didn't want to do business with the Hulkster. Again, we need to go back to earlier in Austin's career to see where this beef started. Austin had a decent mid-card career in WCW during the early 90s. He was tag team champion and United States champion at various points, but when Hogan signed with the company, everything changed. Hogan slotted straight into the main event and he brought a bunch of his friends with him to WCW and they filled up the mid-card. Losers like Brutus Beefcake ended up taking the spots of those wrestlers like Austin, who were already established and had spent years busting their asses. Plus, Austin felt like Hogan was well and truly past his prime by 2002, and he knew that he'd have to work extra hard to make him look good. Then there was the fact that neither man was particularly interested in losing to the other, and so, despite there being loads of money on the table, the match never happened. So we're learning that Austin is a man of principle when it comes to protecting his character, and that was certainly the case with Mark Merrow in 1998. Merrow was a talented and charismatic superstar, and Vince McMahon had high hopes for him at one point. He was scheduled to have a competitive match against Austin on an episode of Raw, but while Austin didn't hate Merrow himself, he certainly hated the idea of getting into the ring with him. You see, despite Merrow being a promising performer, he'd allowed himself to be powerbombed by his girlfriend Sable on an episode of Raw. Austin was not impressed with this one bit. He couldn't understand why Stone Cold would have a competitive match with Merrow, considering he'd just been powerbombed by a woman who weighed 120 pounds, and so the planned match never happened. Austin shut the idea down as soon as McMahon brought it up with him. Safe to say that not much ever came of Mark Merrow from that moment onwards. Another wrestler that McMahon had high hopes for in the 90s was Ahmed Johnson. He wasn't the best wrestler in the world, but he had a great look and a bunch of charisma, and in the WWF, that was all you needed. His career was on the up as he became the first black Intercontinental Champion, but soon he started to get a reputation for having a bad attitude backstage, and he turned out to be incredibly injury prone. In 1998, Johnson claimed that he'd found a racial slur written on his rental car, and he later pointed the finger at Austin, accusing him of being racist. Years later, he discussed Johnson on his podcast alongside Mark Henry. Henry said that he never liked Johnson, that he gave black men a bad name, and even relayed a story about how Johnson tried to slip pills into his drink one night. Austin went on to talk about those allegations of racism from Johnson.
And that guy has said things about me that are untrue. I'm not a fan either. But I wanted to...
Oh, I heard him call you a racist.
Yep.
Out of all the people on earth that's of Caucasian persuasion, I would attest that that you are not a racist.
Thank you for attesting to that.
I heard what he said.
I've never been able to address that because I've never had
or needed
whatever.
to.
Yeah.
You didn't have to validate his stupidity.
No, that's a completely fabricated story and complete horseshit, and I've maintained my silence, and this is the first time I've ever addressed it or talked about it.
I'm glad we can, because the source that it came from was not valid enough for anybody to believe it anyway.
While Austin has stuck to his guns over the people that he didn't like in the business, he does have one regret, and that's his refusal to put over Brock Lesnar in 2002. Lesnar was a rookie at the time, but it was pretty clear that WWE had big plans for him. Amongst those plans was for him to beat Austin clean. Austin was already in a bad place mentally at the time, as he was suffering from burnout and a bunch of nagging injuries, but this suggestion to lose to Lesnar was the straw that broke the camel's back. He was livid at the suggestion that he'd have to lose to this rookie after everything he'd given to WWE, and so he stormed out of the business. Austin later clarified that he would have been happy to work with Lesnar and lose to him if it was on pay-per-view, but they wanted him to lose on a random episode of Raw with no backstory, and that just didn't make any sense to him. He's since said that while he regrets walking away completely, he totally stands by his reasoning. It seems to me that Austin has always been a fair man. If he doesn't like you, then he's got a damn good reason for it.